Whew, that last session was a doozy, wasn't it? All right, what we're going to do now is we're going to look at Genesis chapter 2, verses 24 and 25. We're going to finish up chapter 2. So again, I'm going to share my screen with you, and we will begin to work our way through this. This is really important. If you're married and you're trying to understand the nature of marriage, or if you're wanting to be married and you want to understand God's design for marriage, you have to understand Genesis chapter 2, verses 24 to 25. And again, God is not trying to establish let's just get you to just enjoy your culture and to be happy in your culture. He's trying to tell the nation of Israel, look, the majority of you are going to be married. And in that marriage, there is a design, a divine purpose that God has for that marriage. When you fulfill that purpose, the surrounding nations, these ancient Near Eastern nations, and they're also married, they can see what it is to be rightly related to God in marriage, and radically changes how you view marriage and how you live out your married life. All right, so let me just read verse 24, and then we're going to actually look at it. I will read verses 24 and 25. It says this. It says, for this reason, right, now that there's a man and a woman, for this reason, the man, not the woman, but the man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Verse 25, and the man and the wife were both naked and were not ashamed. All right, so when we look at that and we look at verse 24, there's this idea that you are to leave, that the man and the woman, when they come together, they are to leave, and then they are to cleave, and then they are to become one flesh. And in that, in their nakedness, there's no shame. They simply are naked, and that does not bring any type of shame to them. Now, what I want us to understand, first and foremost, is this is given to Adam and Eve, right? And it says this, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother. Okay, that should make you already start scratching your head and say, okay, wait a minute. Adam and Eve, you were given this by God, and you're to leave, cleave, and become one flesh, and you're to leave your father and mother. Who are your father and mother, right? And so the reality is they're not going to leave God, who is their true father, who's their creator. And so we have to ask ourselves, who's this verse really intended for? And it's intended for them, but not as a married couple, but as a father and a mother, because one day when they have their children, they're going to have to let them go. All right. And that is what I believe this is helping to establish, is for Adam and Eve to understand God's role for marriage, and that at some point he's going to give them children. And how do you deal with your children when they are going to get married? All right. So with that as the context, I want us to understand each of this idea of leave, then cleave, and become one flesh. So let's first begin by looking at the issue of leave. Okay, now leave is a really interesting word, and it has three parts. And the first part is when you think of when a child is born, right, and they're a newborn, they're completely, just to use my hands as the illustration, they are completely dependent upon their parents. They need to be fed, they need to be put down for sleep, they need to be changed, and that is about all of it is. But it's all intertwined, the parents and the child. But then as the child starts to begin to grow up, right, there is this loosening that begins to happen, and the child is able to do more and more for themselves. And when they get married, though, this is how God describes it. Not only in that loosening, right, you're actually to separate. And then within that separation, you're actually to abandon. That's a very strong word. And so what he's trying to establish here is that the man and the woman, when they are married, when they become one flesh, we'll see this in a bit, they become a new family unit. But they have to be able to separate from their parents. And that separation is so strong, it's like an abandonment. Now, that doesn't throw out the later scripture that Moses is going to share with the people, that you need to honor your father and mother. But it really means that at the heart of your relationship between you and your spouse, it has to be greater than your relationship with your parents. And in that sense, you've abandoned your parents, okay, very strong, because your commitment to your spouse is so great. All right. So the first thing is you have to loosen, separate, then abandon. All right. And that's the leave part. Well, when you do that, that's from your parents, but then you are now going to, here's you and here's your spouse. You now mean when this idea of cleave is you're going to start coming together, right? And then you're going to start joining here, and then you're going to be in an unbreakable bond. Cannot be broken. It was never designed to be broken by divorce or death, but both of those will break the marital bond. But more on that later. So if you look at this, when a bone is broken, right, it's separated, right? And then what happens is it comes together and it begins to fuse. And that's the idea of this meaning of cleave. It comes together and it begins to fuse. And finally, when you get to this new bone on the far right, with that green arrow, you have an unbreakable bond. That bone, if it breaks again, once it has fully healed, it will never break in that same spot again, because the new bonding of that is so strong that it will never break in the same place. That's the idea of cleave. So you leave your parents and you cleave to your spouse, an unbreakable bond. And when you do that, the result is, you'll become one flesh. Now, this cartoon, I think, really sort of helps us to understand the nature of sometimes what couples feel is that you've got this wrestling match that's happening between the spouse and the parents. And in the middle is one of the children. And you, as a married couple, need to make sure that never happens. And you, as parents of a married couple, need to make sure that never happens. So we'll first begin with the married couple. The married couple, you are in this inseparable bond, right? You have cleaved to one another. And the better you cleave, the better you leave and the better you cleave, the stronger your marriage will be. What this means is that when a decision needs to be made, and this is in a very practical way, that you as a couple make that decision. Now, also in a practical way, you still want to honor your father and mother, right? And so you can engage them and say, hey, what do you think about this? We're thinking about buying this or buying a car or buying a house. And what are your thoughts? And they can say, well, we think this and this. And at the end of the day, you and your spouse have to make that final decision. That is up to you. That's what it means to become one flesh. You're a new family unit, and you need to make these final decisions. It doesn't have to be uninformed. But you as parents, when you have a child that's in that situation, you need to allow them to fully leave you and to fully cleave to each other so that their marriage is strong and that it rightly represents God and his interests in the world, and so that they can make the invisible God visible. And do not interfere with that. Don't try to manipulate them with their emotions or with money or threaten them. They are a new family unit. But that also means that you don't divorce yourself from them, but you still are engaged and you spend time with them and you talk with them and you relate with them in a proper manner. So that's the nature of this idea of leave, cleave, and become one flesh. And the better we leave and the better we cleave, then the more we are this idea of this one flesh. And again, when we think of this in Trinitarian terms, this is why I say that the purpose of marriage is to make the invisible God visible, because within the Trinity, we said that you have this unity, right? That there's one God, he has one essence, but he's three in persons. And so this one flesh is capturing that unity, this unity idea that they have become one, and that no one should interfere with that oneness, because that helps us to understand the nature of the Trinity, which then helps us to, in that couple's marriage, make the invisible God visible. So I hope this helps you to understand the importance of your marriage, that it's actually like I call it a redemptive window, in which when people from the outside who don't know God, when they look at your marriage, they actually see Christ in your marriage. They see God living himself out through your marriage. And that is very attractive to them. And they will then ask you, can you help me to understand what is going on with you and your spouse? And that gives you an opportunity to help them to understand, hey, this is how God created marriage. This is who Christ is. And this is how he wants to relate to you. So again, these are so incredibly practical. I hope we're not missing out on the practicality. But within that, the nation of Israel needed to really understand this so they could rightly represent God and his interests before these other ancient Near Eastern cultures, these pagan cultures, and we are to do the same in our world today.